Is Eric Vey. I'm the Interpretive Program Coordinator here at Wargo Nature Center. Thank you for joining us for our Lunch with the Naturalist. This is a special one because we have a guest instructor for it. Normally we do this with one of our naturalists presenting, but Dr. Potter from Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve is joining us today to talk about fire and fire ecology and prescribed burning. So we're very excited for that. So how this will work is Dr. Potter has about 45 minutes or so of her presentation. We're going to try to primarily save questions for the end. That said, if you have questions as we go along where you need something really clarified that you'd like right then, if you could throw it in the chat, that would be great. I will be monitoring the chat and I'll just interrupt as needed. If there's something you're not clear on, sometimes it may be coming up in an upcoming slide. So if you hold on a second, you might see your answer as well. Just other Zoom etiquette, I'm sure most folks are familiar with this at this point, but if you could just go ahead and keep yourself muted during the main presentation. And at the end, during questions, we can either have you unmute or type in the chat as well. So with that, if there are no questions right off the bat, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Potter to introduce herself and tell us about what she has for us today.
Well, thank you, Eric. And thank you, all of you, for being here. I know it is kind of a funny time of day. I really love these lunchtime programs. I feel like especially now that we've shifted to Zoom and virtual programs in light of the pandemic, it's been really rewarding to see the folks that are able to attend these lunchtime talks. I know at least a few of you are tuning in on a lunch break from work. So thank you for spending part of your workday. I'm also really excited to be here. Third time is the charm. This talk was originally scheduled for last March as an in-person talk at Wargo, and I was very excited. I was going to get to come and see the owl at Wargo being fed, in addition to giving my talk. Then, of course, that had to get canceled. It got rescheduled for October, and now it's been rescheduled for today, and it's actually happening. If all of you haven't been to Wargo, as things continue to open up, I really encourage you to visit. It's a wonderful facility, some really great parks, really phenomenal programming, interesting animals, good people. So check it out if you are ever in the Lino Lakes area. As Eric mentioned, my name is Caitlin. I don't think I've ever been called Dr. Potter that many times in such a short period. I've had my PhD for 7 years now, and I'm still getting used to that job title. I'm going to be talking today about prescribed burning. My goal is to give you a little bit of background on prescribed fire as a landscape management tool and as a restoration tool, give you a little bit of background on Cedar Creek, which is where I work, and then spend the meat of my lecture talking about the work that we do at Cedar Creek using fire as a research tool and as a research variable. I'll show you some results from particular experiments related to old fields, old abandoned agricultural fields, to oak savannas, and then a little bit about the animal side of things. I'll wrap up at the very end with some unanswered questions and some new directions related to fire that we're pursuing, and happy to talk about anything else, fire or Cedar Creek related, that you all might be wondering about. All right, jumping right in, what is prescribed burning? So prescribed burning is just a planned fire that's used to meet some sort of land management or research objective. The prescribed or prescription part of it is that this is a fire that requires a really specific set of environmental conditions in order to get approval to take place. So you have to, essentially in the same way you'd go to the doctor and have a really detailed prescription written out for a particular medication to deal with a particular medical issue you're having, a prescribed fire needs a prescription that says the type of wind, the speed, the direction, the air temperature, the humidity, what's going on with your grass and your other fuels. And all of those things have to be right in order for you to get prescriptions to do a fire to meet a particular objective. So we do a lot of burning at Cedar Creek. We burn about 900 acres of our landscape. but only certain areas can be burned on certain times. If it gets too windy, the burns get shut down. If there was too much water in the grass, the burns get shut down. So these are done in collaboration with the state, with the DNR, with natural resource professionals, as well as with our scientists. When we think of fire, we often think of fire as a bad thing, particularly in modern society. When we read the news and there's a fire, it usually involves destruction and fear and loss of life, human or animal, loss of structures. It can be a really devastating thing, but fire is actually not a bad thing for many natural ecosystems. Fire can be really good for a lot of native plants, particularly in areas like savannas and prairies. When you burn things that are woody, like shrubs, hazelnuts, and stuff like that, get knocked back, and the native grasses and flowering plants can thrive. The blackened soil that is left after a burn warms up really quickly in the sun, and that can promote germination of a lot of seeds. And then there's a lot of evidence, especially from prairies, that burning on a somewhat regular cycle using these prescribed burns promotes diversity, improves habitat, and provides a whole bunch of resources for savanna specialists, birds and mammals and things that really only thrive in these fire-dependent ecosystems. A lot of those animals also rely on things besides just resources, as we traditionally think of them. Fire is good for native animals because it kills off some trees and leaves these incredible standing snags on the landscape. It can provide lush grass and clear areas for grassland birds that otherwise can't thrive as trees and other woody plants come in. There's a fair amount of evidence that highly variable and irregular fires in particularly oak-dominated systems can spur acorn production in the year following a burn. And so for animals like deer and turkey that rely, or bear, that rely on acorns as a food source, fire can really help kind of make those boom and bust years more boom-y and less bust-y. And then there's some evidence as well that there are a number of fire-dependent microbes that live in the soil, as well as fire-dependent plants and animals that really can't exist without these kind of regular burns. Turns out prescribed burning is also good for people. If you've followed any of the wildfire news out west, you might know that the big catastrophic fires that have been happening for the last decade or two in places like California are a direct result of fire suppression, a long history of fire suppression in the West, where when natural fires started, people went out and put them out because we thought fire was a bad thing. But it turns out when you can burn regularly and remove some of the dead trees and some of the fuel load that accumulates on the ground in leaf litter or in fallen trees and all of those shrubs, you can reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires. Kind of the ounce of prevention bit. Right? If you can do lots of little things regularly when it comes to fire, you can prevent the large, once in a decade sort of disastrous things that are so bad for people and for structures. In this part of the world, particularly in East Central Minnesota, we know a decent amount, mostly coming from research at places like Cedar Creek, about what fire was like before European settlement in this area. So we know that East Central Minnesota historically was this mosaic of prairies and savannas. We'll talk a bit more about what savannas are in a moment, but these kind of patchy landscapes maintained by periodic burns. Some of these burns we can tell from looking at tree cores and charcoal signatures over time were started by lightning strikes. Many of them, though, were started by people managing the landscape for particular resources. So prescribed burning is not a new invention. It wasn't always called prescribed burning when it was practiced in the pre-settlement era by indigenous people, but it served the same purposes. What we see in those pre-settlement landscapes is the evolution of vegetation that's adapted for fire. So deep-rooted prairie grasses where you can burn off the top and they have enough energy stored in their roots to regrow pretty quickly after a fire. Trees like bur oak that have really corky bark and can withstand even high intensity burns, trees that sprout really fast after a fire and grow quickly between fires. And all of these bits and pieces of vegetation give us some powerful evidence that fire was a part of this landscape, and fire shaped the landscape here in East Central Minnesota. After Europeans moved into this part of the world, we started building up towns and cities and metropolitan areas as we started packing more people into small places and putting up houses and buildings of other types. Fire became dangerous and fire became an issue in a lot of communities. And so as a culture, we started instituting policies of fire suppression, where if something small started, we put it out as quickly as we could. And that's good for people, but it turns out that that has really big impacts on our habitats, more than we might think at first glance. And there's some, if you want to read more about this, I've been trying hard to put citations for the papers that I reference at the bottom of these slides. So you can look up some good Cedar Creek papers. The one that I reference on this side from Behringer-Lays is about that pre-settlement dynamic, looking at Cedar Creek tree cores. So now I know a little bit about kind of the what of fire. I want to give you just a couple of slides about the where of Cedar Creek, because I know many of you probably have not had the chance to visit Cedar Creek. I always like to start with the zoomed out view when I talk about the work that we do on site. Minnesota is quite lucky. Many of you I know on this call are master naturalists, so you're already well aware of the fact that Minnesota as a state sits at the intersection of North America's 3 largest biomes, the grassland or prairie, which is a heavily grass-dominated system, the deciduous forests, what we call the big woods here in Minnesota. Those are your maples and oaks and basswood that change color in the fall, drop their leaves. And then the coniferous forest or the boreal forest, your evergreens, your pines and spruces up north. Cedar Creek, by a quirk of location and geology, has examples of all of these major biomes and all of the representative habitats on our property. The university owns about 5,500 acres of land at Cedar Creek, and you can find prairie and grassland. You can find oak savanna. You can find old growth hardwood forests. You can find coniferous forests, and all of the dynamics that exist kind of statewide can be found in little small fragments at Cedar Creek, which is pretty cool. We're located about half an hour driving from Wargo, north and a little bit west, up Highway 65 due north of the Twin Cities in East Bethel. What we are is primarily a place for scientific research. So this land is set aside for study, for teaching and learning. We are increasingly, however, also a place for people to come and connect with nature, and a place for people to come and learn. Whether you are a kid or a kid at heart, we have opportunities for you to come and learn a little bit about what we do and what the life of a scientist entails. Since 1942, we've been trying to study the world around us at Cedar Creek. This involves a lot of kind of groundbreaking and field shifting experiments, many of which you're probably familiar with, even if you didn't know that they were from Cedar Creek or from Minnesota even. Cedar Creek is home to the world's longest running experiment on biodiversity. Dave Tillman's big biodiversity experiment, which was the first experiment in the world to use biodiversity as the variable that was manipulated. This experiment has changed the way that we look at the world. We now know from Dave's work and from the work of others that built on his experiment that having many different types of plants and animals in a small space is actually really good, not just for human aesthetics, but for the plants and animals that live there. So biodiversity is important for community dynamics and community functioning. One of the things we know about fire is that it helps maintain diversity. So having these long-term results is really important. We're also home to Ray Lindemann's work on food webs. So in the 1940s, Ray Lindemann was a graduate student at the U. He did work at Cedar Creek, kind of studying all aspects of this one small lake and articulating the way in which energy flows through a food web. This had never been done before. It's one of the few fundamental rules in ecology now. It's called Lindemann's 10% rule. And it also, like Dave's experiments on biodiversity, shifted the way that we look at the world. This gives us some powerful tools to start looking into dynamics in an ecosystem like the oak savanna, where we know that inputs from kind of the abiotic realm, things like fire, impact food sources and the energy that's then available for the things that eat the acorns or the hazelnuts. We also are home to the world's longest continuously running free air carbon enrichment experiment, which is a fancy climate change and global change experiment that's pictured down there in that little circle. This is an experiment called Biocon, and it allows scientists to try and look into the future by manipulating temperature and carbon dioxide levels and nitrogen levels so that we can see how systems like prairies will survive in a changing world. Fire plays into this as well. We know that many of the changes that are happening to our climate as things dry out and heat up, as rainfall patterns shift and become more variable, fire becomes an increasingly kind of in our face dynamic. As a lot of these fuels become more and more kind of apt to go up at a moment's notice. So understanding what we have to look forward to gives us some clues about how to manage our resources. We also do a lot of work on wildlife conservation. Pictured here is an oak savanna specialist, the redheaded woodpecker, one of those fire-dependent species. And so we're starting to use fire as a way to dig into a lot of different questions and have been doing so for decades. Overall, our mission is to find sustainable solutions to environmental challenges through research, through conservation, and through education and community engagement. Fire, again, is one of those threads that can weave through all aspects of our mission, which is why I was really excited when Eric asked if I could talk about this topic in particular, because it's not just research and it's not just conservation and land management. It is something that is a tool that fits into all aspects of what we do at Cedar Creek. All right, so what do we do at Cedar Creek when it comes to prescribed burning? Yeah, please.
Can I actually interrupt you real quick? We did have one question. If you're not planning to cover this already, there was a question. Could you explain a little bit more about fire-dependent microbes?
Ooh, yes. Well, sort of. Not my personal area of expertise. So I can find some citations and send them your way. But one of the things that we do at Cedar Creek is study a lot of things and dynamics that are happening in the soil. So nutrient cycling, decomposition, dynamics kind of in the very top layer of the soil where the organic material builds up, as well as deeper in the soil down to, in many cases, a meter or two in depth, looking at what microbes live where, what fungi live where, how nutrients are flowing. And there is quite a bit of evidence that have come out of some of our oak savanna burn experiments that fire shapes those soil communities in really unexpected ways. So in the same way that there are plants and animals that are adapted to deal with regular fire, there are also whole microbial communities that are adapted to deal with regular fire. It's an interesting thing to think about because you'll see, I'll show you a video in a moment of a burn in progress, and you will see that when that burn goes through, there is not a lot of organic material left on the ground. So if you're a microbe that lives in those top couple of centimeters in the leaf litter, and that leaf litter or that grass litter evaporates, you probably evaporate too. So there are folks that look at the soil science side of things and start investigating what those communities are like in places that see regular burns compared to places that don't. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Soil science is something that is an area of study that is increasingly blowing up at Cedar Creek and at other places. There's a lot of tools that didn't exist 5 or 10 or 15 years ago that exist now. A lot of cool genomic sequencing work that's going on, and I think a lot more to come in the future. My cat has decided to join the Zoom call. He's got like the world's tiniest tail, so that's probably all you'll see of him, which is good. He is not fire adapted. All right, so fire at Cedar Creek. Prescribed burning is one of the longest running research projects that we have on site. We've been burning as part of research projects since 1964. That makes us now one of the world's longest continuously running fire experiments worldwide, which is pretty impressive. We study the effects of fire at a whole range of scales. Something scientists love to do is investigate different scales. So seeing how, for example, fire affects individual animals, individual red-headed woodpeckers nesting in particular fire frequencies, how fire affects communities of things like microbes, and how fire affects a whole ecosystem on the scale of something like the oak savanna or a grassland remnant. Our overarching goal is to maintain our grasslands, which we know are fire dependent, and then also to help develop effective restoration methods that can be used in some of these less studied ecosystems, things like oak savanna, things like abandoned agricultural land where nature is reclaiming swaths of Minnesota that used to be heavily fertilized or used to be tilled or used to be plowed, but now are not, and maybe don't have fire but could benefit from it. So we're trying to understand the dynamics of this natural disturbance, and use the things that we learn as scientists to inform land management for other people across Minnesota and across the state. Or sorry, across the state and across the region. You can see in these pictures a little bit of what prescribed fire at Cedar Creek looks like. That left-hand most picture is from the early days of prescribed burning in the 1960s. You can see not a lot of protective gear, not a lot of super sophisticated equipment, just a guy with a helmet and a little can of gasoline starting a fire. In the middle, you can see what fire looks like now at Cedar Creek, and surprisingly, not all that much has changed. We do have better protective gear now, so our fire crews all wear Nomex, which is what wildland firefighters wear. It's like a very flame-resistant material, but we still use those same drip torches, cans of fuel that you just drip on the place you want to start the fire and drop your match. We do have trucks filled with water tanks and a lot more people working on these burns, which is good because some of them are 50, 60, 70 acres in size, and you want more than 1 or 2 people managing a fire that's on that scale. Particularly when you start getting out of the kind of open grassland areas and into the more savanna areas like we see on that right-hand picture, and you start having to worry about fire climbing up trees and getting into canopies. Since I know many of you have not worked on a burn or gotten a chance to be right next to a prescribed burn, I wanted to throw in one video. This is a clip from a couple of years ago of a spring burn in that big biodiversity experiment. So this is a prairie plot. It's burned every spring. So the grass there is 1 year's worth of biomass. And oops, as you will see, it goes up pretty quickly. As it turns out, you just have to start the fire with that drip torch, and then the fuel and the wind, that's the reason behind those prescriptions about wind speed and direction. The wind will do the rest of the work. And if you look behind where the fire was compared to where the fire is going, you can see it does a pretty thorough job of knocking back all that grass. What's left behind is that nice, black, easy to heat up soil. Within usually a few days, if there's rain, or a week if there's not a lot of rain, we start seeing new growth in those burned areas, which is always exciting. All right, I want to dig in a little bit more into some of our research results now that you know kind of why we burn and where we are at Cedar Creek. The first thing we use fire for is just management in our long-term experiments. So like I just showed you in those prairie plots in the biodiversity experiment, there are some areas of Cedar Creek where we burn every year. That helps remove biomass, which makes our scientists' jobs a lot easier. If you're trying to measure annual productivity in an area, at the end of the season, it can be pretty hard to sort out what grew this year from what grew last year. So these burns kind of give us a clean slate for our data collection. They also mimic natural dynamics. Fire is an important part of prairie systems. So in these prairie experiments, we try and mimic that with annual burns. We also use our burns as training opportunities for graduate students, for interns, for some of our lead scientists as well. If you're someone that is interested in fire ecology, you have to take your first steps somewhere. And Cedar Creek is a great place to take those first steps. So we use some of these smaller, more contained burns where maybe you have a 2x2 meter square of prairie grass or a 9x9 meter square of prairie grass with a really big fire break next to it as an opportunity to practice your skills. We also use fire as a research tool. One of our long-running experiments is called the Old Field Chrono Sequence. This is a big part of Cedar Creek's landscape where different sections were abandoned from agriculture on a somewhat regular basis from 1927 through the present day. So the vast majority of Cedar Creek's what are now grasslands were ag and farm fields and row crops and in cereal for many, many years. And we're able to study kind of what happens to abandoned agricultural land and how might fire help us achieve our recolonization goals, our restoration goals. Turns out fire is a huge tool in a restoration land manager's toolkit, particularly if they're working with these abandoned agricultural lands. Some work that has just come out in the last couple of years from one of our graduate students, Adam Clark, showed that in these old fields, when you burn annually or every couple of years, you start seeing increases in abundance for a lot of our native plants, some of those native grasses, some of the native flowering plants, some of our sedges. Some of those increases in abundance are short-lived and only happen in the first 10 or 20 or 30 years after a field is abandoned, and then you start to lose the effect of fire. But for others, it persists, which is pretty cool. Interestingly, the trend does not hold for our exotic species. So some of the challenges with restoring old cropland is that it's hard to get native plants to reestablish. If you ever have kind of abandoned part of your yard, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. As much as you want all of those like big blue stem and your milkweeds and all the things that we think of as quintessential Minnesota prairie plants to come in and take over, what you get is like quackgrass. Or you start getting buckthorn, or you start getting these exotic species that aren't what you were hoping for. Those species tend to not be adapted for fire. And so burning in these experiments kills off those exotic species and promotes the growth of the native species. And that can move the needle on the restoration timeline. We also start seeing increased productivity. So that's what we measure as biomass, just more stuff growing each year when you burn. Burning stimulates plant growth for a lot of grass species. It's like getting a little haircut and then all the new hair comes back up. And it cuts down on litter. So on all of the matted down old grasses from the past year that can block light for new things that are coming up.
Caitlin, could you, there was a question, could you clarify what C3 and C4 are?
Absolutely. C3 and C4 are they're photosynthetic pathways, so they're ways that plants make energy. We have some types of plants, and C3 and C4 are usually mostly grasses, though not exclusively grasses when we talk about them in this context. We've got plants that are adapted for dry and arid conditions. That close their stomata during the day so they don't lose a lot of water, and they do a lot of their photosynthesis at night. And then we have kind of what we think of as more traditional plants that have their stomata open during the day and are doing all of their kind of food production during the day because they're not so worried about those dry and arid conditions. So it's a way that scientists split up what we call functional groups, plants that make their livelihood in slightly different ways, and thus are expected to respond to things like fire in slightly different ways. Great question. We also, I would say the bulk of our fire research is is not in those old fields, but is in the savannas. Cedar Creek is quite lucky because we have some of the largest continuous fragments of oak savanna in the state. So we're able to manage them with fire in a number of different ways. So we can manage different sections of the oak savanna with different fire frequencies, and start learning really how this dynamic plays out on a fine scale. If you're not familiar with oak savannas, I would not be surprised. They are one of the most threatened and most quickly disappearing landscapes in the world. They are this funny, unstable equilibrium. They are not quite a prairie, although they do have a lot of grasses and flowering plants that we expect to find in a prairie. They're not quite a forest. They do have trees, but the trees tend to be pretty far apart. You can see an example of an oak savanna at Cedar Creek behind me in my Zoom background, and you can see that there are some parts that look just like a prairie, some parts that look more like a forest, and it's that in-between unstable dynamic that we look for when we're defining an oak savanna. They tend to have a canopy cover between 10 and 50%. That's like how much light comes through in a given area, and how much light is blocked by trees. If you're less than 10% canopy cover, you get defined as a prairie. If you're more than 50%, you get defined as a forest. So savannas occupy this kind of in-between space. Oak savannas tend to be filled with fire-resistant or fire-dependent trees. As the name suggests, these tend to be oaks. Bur oaks are the kind of quintessential example of an oak savanna tree. If you picture like a old, gnarled, not that big, fire stunted, but very old looking tree. In Minnesota, that's probably a bur oak. Our savannas also have a lot of pin oak. They tend to grow a lot faster than the bur oaks, and they take over in some places. You've also got a lot of fire-loving prairie grasses that fill up that understory. And then in areas that are not burned very regularly, you start getting things like hazelnut and raspberry coming in as well. There's currently estimated to be less than 25,000 acres of oak savanna left in total nationwide. That's not a lot of oak savanna, and most of it is quite heavily fragmented. So fragments of less than 100 acres. And as I mentioned, they're one of the rarest plant communities in the world. In Minnesota, we have less than 0.1% of the original oak savanna that used to cover the state remaining. Some of the best examples are at Cedar Creek, at Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, in Elk River, and up at Camp Ripley, not far from Little Falls. When you look down from the sky, this is kind of a quintessential oak savanna look, the area with the scattered trees that kind of make a bit of a triangle down at the bottom. Up on the upper left and on the right-hand side are big marshes, which often abut the oak savannas, at least at Cedar Creek. So where did the oak savanna go? If there's less than 0.1% of our oak savanna remaining, where is the other 99.9? Oak savannas were like the perfect place to build a house. If you were a settler coming in from the east, looking for a place to set up shop, you could have a nice big oak tree that provided shade for your house. You didn't have to chop down a whole forest or remove all those stumps if you wanted to plant crops. So these got turned over pretty quickly into developed areas. And then in the modern day, we've gotten rid of a lot of the dynamics that allowed these unstable systems to persist. So we've gotten rid of large grazing herbivores, which we'll talk about on a later slide as an important dynamic in these systems. We've suppressed fire. And it turns out this is a system that requires active management, whether it's grazing or fire. If you just leave oak savannas as they are with no fire, no grazing, they quickly turn into oak woodland. The trees take over and crowd out the grasses. So at Cedar Creek, we've been trying to figure out, knowing that fire is an important dynamic, how often should we burn to keep our oak savannas as oak savannas? To answer this question, we have designated different sections of our property as different burn units. So that's what the BU on all of these little Post-it notes is, burn unit 106, burn unit 503. And then the bit in parentheses tells you the frequency at which that particular little area is burned. So we have some areas that are not burned at all. One example is burn unit 110 up here, kind of in the top center of this graph. You can tell even from the satellite image, that is not an oak savanna any longer. It hasn't been burned since at least 1964. It is now a forest. We also have areas that are burned 1 out of every 2 years, 2 out of every 3 years, 1 out of every 3 years, 4 out of every 5 years, 9 out of every 10 years, kind of this whole range of both interval and variability. And what we have found is that there is this pretty narrow window where oak savannas are happy. They are the areas that are in dark brown on this figure. So areas that either have a short, median, or mean fire interval, so relatively frequent burns every 2 or 3 or 4 years, and a high variability in interval. So if you're 1 out of every 2 years, it's not going to be 1 year on, 1 year off, 1 year on, 1 year off. It might be 3 years with fire in a row, and then a year without, and then a year with, and then 2 or 3 years without. And the average fire interval still ends up being 1 out of every 2 years, but there's lots of variability. That's a system where you can get oak savannas. The oaks are able to survive by growing fairly large enough to escape the burns during those years with lots of gaps between fire in that high variability scenario. The other way you can get oak savannas is by lengthening the time between burns, but making them more regular. So having a kind of 1 out of 20 year burn can help, but it has to be 1 out of 20 years, every 20 years, not 2 years in a row and then nothing for 38 years. That kind of long time period, again, lets the oaks grow big enough to survive the fires, but those fires once every 20 years knock back things like maple that otherwise are fast growing and outcompete the oaks. So there's a couple ways you can get oak savannas. We do know that fire is important. We do know that there's a lot of species that take advantage of this variation in fire, both in mean fire interval and in variability. Things like redheaded woodpeckers. The fact that we manage our landscapes with fires is one of the reasons we think that we are home to the state's densest breeding population of this otherwise disappearing bird. Oak savanna specialists that require fire are few and far between, but the redheaded woodpecker is probably the most characteristic of them. These birds nest in the snags that are left behind after a fire goes through and kills older, weaker trees. They get most of their protein, especially in the summer, from fly catching. So instead of most woodpeckers, we think about using nuts as their big protein resource. Redheaded woodpeckers will use those open areas in the savanna to swoop down and grab dragonflies and beetles and grasshoppers, and that's what they eat in the summer. So they really make use of both the tree section and the prairie section. And when we overlay kind of the distribution of nests that we see on the property with those fire frequencies, we can see quite a strong correlation. The areas that are never burned, so like 309, have very few trees with nests in them, even though there are a lot of trees. The areas that are burned extremely frequently and end up as prairie, things like the upper portions of 108, where you can see not a lot of trees, just a lot of open space, also have few nests, not too surprising. And where we see the highest number of nests is in these areas that are burned, in this case, 25 to 36 times since 1964, which ends up being in that like 1 out of every 3, 4 out of 5, between those kind of variable ranges. We know fire is important. We've been asking these questions about how often we should burn. What we have learned since 1964 is that there is no answer to that question. There is no answer to exactly how regular is the perfect amount. What we have been learning, kind of surprisingly, is that prescribed burning actually seems to be slowly killing our oak savannas. Um, when we kind of leave that fire interval to the 1 out of 10 or longer sort of time frame, there is so much fuel on the landscape that those irregular burns kill the young oak trees. When we burn more regularly, we also kill the young oak trees because they don't have enough time to get big enough to survive. So we end up with these areas like pictured in this photo where we have lots of tall, healthy trees that are 40 or 50 or 60 years old, and really nothing younger than that. So in the time since we've started doing this experiment, we've seen pretty low levels of oak recruitment, young oaks coming back and replacing the old ones that get killed off. This is a major concern, obviously, because we don't want our management system to be producing like a picture perfect savanna that is not functional. We're also concerned about the fact that things like oak wilts are coming through and killing trees with or without fire. And if those aren't being replaced, we're going to lose all of our oaks eventually. So we have started adding another dynamic to our oak savannas. One theory about how to restore that balance and let those young oak trees survive is to bring grazers back. So since 2018, we have had a summer herd of bison at Cedar Creek. And what the bison do, as you must imagine, I'm sure, is eat the grass. So they're chowing down on the fuel that fuels those fires. We want to know, do they leave the oaks alone? And do they eat enough grass that when we burn, the fires are patchier or lower in temperature or otherwise happening in a way that lets oaks survive when they haven't been surviving before? In that video, we saw how intense a burn can be after just 1 year of growth. If you put a bison in there, a lot of that biomass and that fuel disappears. So we have overlaid this bison experiment on top of that large burning experiment. That black rectangle down at the bottom of the map shows where the bison are. And you can see there are some parts of each of these burn units that are outside the fence and not being grazed. There are some parts of each of these burn units that are inside the fence and are being grazed. So we're able to start teasing apart the relative contributions of fire on its own and fire plus bison together. We also have little fenced off areas within the fence where kind of the nutrient addition that bison do when they poop their 3 gallons of poop a day and stimulate lots of plant growth. Those impacts of bison are still there, but these fences, these very small fences, keep bison from eating the grass, so we can start teasing out just the effect of the grazing as well. We have planted inside and outside of those grazing exclosures, I think about 700 young oak trees. This allows us to see kind of if the bison are in fact ignoring the oak trees, as we hope they would, or if they are eating them or trampling them or wallowing on them, and if kind of the impact of bison grazing or the impact of bison doing everything but grazing within inside these little fences matters for oaks. And then we add the fire as well, of course. What we have found, even in just the first couple of years, is that grazing makes a huge difference in managing fire behavior. So I want to first look at this picture on the left. The fence line for the bison, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's a road sort of thing that goes from the bottom left of that picture up toward like the center right. That's where the bison fence is. The bison graze on the right-hand side of that. They do not graze on the left-hand side. This was all burned as one burn, and you can tell just from looking that the fire had a huge impact, very scorched there on the areas that are not grazed, much patchier, and not looking nearly as scorched on the areas that were grazed. So the fact that the bison ate down that grass meant that the fire couldn't sweep through everything, and it turns out it left many of our oaks surviving. This picture on the right is that same part of the property. The ungrazed area is on the bottom, the grazed area is up on the top. This is just a more top-down view. And a notable thing about this one is if you look on the top left of the picture, you can see a very small, very dark square. That's that grazing exposure. So that's the area where we let bison kind of wander around, poop nearby, do all of their bison-y things, but not eat the grass. And you can tell that that burned in a really different way than the surrounding areas. It turns out that having bison graze this landscape lowers fire temperatures by about 180 degrees Celsius. That's a phenomenal change. Hot fire consumes everything. Less hot fire lets some things escape. So the change in fire temperature, along with the change in fire behavior, like the patchiness, turns out to make a big difference. After our first year of burning post bison grazing, about 90% of those 700 or so oaks that we had planted survived. In the areas where we don't have bison grazing, none of those oaks survived. So this does seem like a dynamic that has the potential to change the way that we manage these systems. I see there's a question about bison grazing and cattle grazing, and I see the question from Lisa as well. Dan's wondering, is there much difference between bison grazing and cattle grazing? The answer is yes. Bison tend to take a bite, take a step, take a bite, take a step. They are always on the move. And so their impact on the landscape gets spread out over a very large area. Cattle tend to stand in one spot, eat until there's nothing else to eat, and then move to a new spot. So they tend to graze things down much closer to the ground than the bison do. Does it mean you can't use cattle for managing oak savannas? No. You just have to do it in a smart way and keep an eye on the cattle and move them probably more regularly than they would move themselves so that you're not grazing the grass down to absolutely nothing. There is some work going on at Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge looking at cattle grazing as a potential kind of restoration tool in their oak savannas. So we're looking forward to comparing results with them as both of our projects scale up over the next couple of years and contributing to Extension is now running this like statewide oak savanna learning network that will pull results both from the cattle side of things and from the bison side of things. You can also hay in these systems if you don't have the capacity to graze. So it's the same sort of process. You're removing a bunch of the fuel, removing a bunch of the prairie grass so it doesn't catch on fire. Obviously, going through and haying and baling up that hay and taking it out is going to have a different set of impacts than it being digested by something like a cow or a bison and pooped back out on the landscape. But haying can also be a really good strategy for managing these systems. That Oak Savanna Learning Network also kind of gets to Lisa's question about whether Cedar Creek is using what we learned to manage the oak savannas or continuing to do research or both. The answer is a resounding both. We are definitely taking what we learn and sharing it with other folks that are managing these savannas or managing particular aspects of oak savannas. So we're working on best management plans for woodpeckers. We're sharing data about this bison project, and we've been sharing data for the last several decades about the fire project as well. But as all good scientists do, the more we learn, the more questions we have. And so we are continuing to research, especially because we're finding that the answers are not as straightforward as we thought they might be when we set out to do these projects in the 60s. We thought we were going to get an answer that's like, if you just burn once out of every 7 years, you'll end up with an oak savanna. But of course, it's not that simple. And that's kind of like, that's the gist of all of it, right? This is a really ancient and fundamental dynamic in a whole lot of ecosystems. Fire is important for a lot of reasons. There's a whole lot of plants and animals that are adapted to live with this natural dynamic. But we as humans don't understand nearly as much as we think we do about how to make use of this tool in a way that's really productive for these systems. So there's a ton still to learn. There's a lot of great people statewide doing really cool work using fire. And Cedar Creek continues to kind of push the bounds of what we know as a scientific institution, and what we can learn that hopefully will be of benefit to others. That's what I've got for you today. I know we have a few minutes for questions, if people have more questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to just chat about anything, fire or otherwise.
I have a question.
Go for it.
I gotta find myself so you could see me. Hi. It's more about biodiversity. I know Tamarack Nature Center in White Bear Lake, they removed trees just so they could have their native trees there. And that's a second question about native trees. But my first question is, once it was removed, they replanted the trees, all in a row, and they put a fence around it, and the trees won't grow. So I'm wondering if this idea of maybe having a controlled burning would be a better way, to get the nutrients in the soil to then plant rows of trees.
It really depends on both what you're planting and what your environment looks like to begin with. We have been doing something similar up at Cedar Creek. We're working to build a new nature trail behind our main building. It's in this field that historically has just been grassland, and we're working on transplanting a bunch of native trees. And we did burn it before we put the trees in. We just burned all the grass to the ground, and that's really helpful as a kind of blank slate sort of piece. Remove some of the competition for the plants that you want to grow. But many trees are not adapted for fire. Certainly, like things like maple and basswood have to be a big enough size to survive the fire. And so fire might not be the most appropriate kind of restoration tool for the trees that are being planted. Restoration is a really complicated topic. It's very site dependent. You have to know a lot about your local ecology, your local water table and hydrologic cycles, and to have really specific management goals. And a lot of that involves waiting, which can be really frustrating. So the trees that we put in at Cedar Creek last fall are trees that we took out from elsewhere on the property and dropped in. And we have to irrigate them now until they're established. We have deer fences around them because the deer will hammer them, and we don't want that extra stress on these already stressed out trees that we dug up and moved. And there's a good chance that only half of them will survive. So we transplanted, I think, 23 bur oaks. They're 30-year-old bur oaks from one of the experiments that's no longer in use. We're really hoping we get between 30 and 50% survival. So those all in a row, not thriving concerns may be short-term concerns, hopefully, that over time will sort themselves out. Trees especially take a really long time.
And I just wanted to...
About native trees, part of my question was, how far back do you go in time to consider native trees? Because in reality, if you go all the way back, we had palm trees here at one time.
Yeah, Eric, do you want to jump in and say something about restoration before I talk about shifting baselines?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say about planting the trees in general, and I'm not familiar with what particular trees they planted or where they did there, but trees can just be sensitive in general, depending on the root structure when you put it in, or planting depth, issues with root wear. So I don't know that it is that, but it could certainly be other things besides the exact nutrients, whether they're burning or not too. So just something else to consider with that as well.
Absolutely. How far back do you go is a constant question in ecology. There's this whole subfield that looks at shifting baselines, particularly as they fit with various restoration goals. So there are many people whose restoration goal is restoring the US and prairies and savannas specifically to the Pleistocene. and the species that were here in the Pleistocene. It's called Pleistocene rewilding. It is fascinating. It is worth a Google. There's lots of interesting articles about it. Folks that would like to have, cheetahs and the American equivalent of elephants and things like that back on our landscapes. And so their target for restoration is this very particular kind of vision that happened well before kind of large scale human settlement and may not be practical in the world that we live in now. There's also people on the other side of the spectrum for whom the baseline is something in the future. So you may be familiar, if you've been following Minnesota forestry, with the talks that Dr. Lee Freilich has given about projections of where tree habitat will shift in the coming centuries. And he advocates for planting oaks up on the North Shore, because a lot of the climate projections say that the habitat that exists up there now is not going to exist up there much longer. And if we can plant for the future and start putting in trees that, are not native to the North Shore necessarily, but put them in now and help them to thrive so that they're healthy, strong adults in a future when the conditions are right for that species, that would be the way to go with restoration and everything in between. So what is a native species and where should it go? Depends on who's asking and answering the question.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, really good things to think about. Restoration, it's like fire, right? We think we know a lot, but every time we actually dig into these projects, we learn new things and we get new questions to ask and answer. There's no nice recipe. There's just a lot of tests, some of which work better than others.
Excellent. Thank you, Caitlin. And if folks have other questions, again, you're welcome to put them in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, feel free to go ahead and do so. I did also put in there Chris Helzer's blog, prairieecologist.com. He's pretty well known in sort of the restoration field. He's in Nebraska, but he does have some thoughts on use of cattle and other grazing animals, specifically for prairie. So just some other perspectives on that if you want to read more about it.
The Nature Conservancy does a lot of really great work. We partner with the Nature Conservancy to manage some land just across the street from Cedar Creek, the Helen Allison Scientific and Natural Area. It is another little patch of oak savanna that the Nature Conservancy owns, and they manage it with the DNR as an SNA, and our teams help with some of the monitoring and some of the burns from time to time as well. Nature Conservancy also has really good resources. They have some top-notch people there on their staff, particularly in the Midwest region, in my experience. Any cool upcoming research we'll be doing in the next few years? Great question, Lisa. There are always new things in the hopper, right? The Bison project is probably our biggest and most visible new direction. We've gotten some really compelling results from the first couple of years of work, but one of the things about adding such a massive dynamic like grazing back to a landscape that hasn't had it in a long time is that you don't really know if you could trust your first couple of years of work because there's this like, oh my God, what's happening response that, for example, the plants have to being eaten down by bison on a large scale. So we're really excited for that project to continue and to see what results are kind of a blip in a long-term pattern and what are some longer-term things that come out of that. Our Redheaded woodpecker project in the Savannah has a really exciting new direction. Those of you who are in the Master Naturalist class heard me talk about this yesterday, but we have just launched, like literally yesterday, a new trail camera project that looks at red-headed woodpecker nest cavities. I'm just going to pull the URL and drop it in the chat. It went into beta testing yesterday. It is almost out of data already because we only put up a few hundred videos for people to look at and give us feedback on. But we have about 200,000 video clips, I think, from these woodpecker nests in the oak savanna that we will be uploading for volunteers to help us go through in the next few weeks and months. So check it out, help out. We're really excited to learn more about vertebrate interactions in this particular system. We also have our other brand new experiment is a large scale experiment with a specific focus on restoration. It's called the rescue experiment. It's a habitat fragmentation experiment. So there are all these kind of very large hexagons on the landscape, which have between 1% and I think 90% of their kind of naturally occurring biomass removed. So you have very tiny fragments, you have much larger fragments. It looks, if you've ever played Settlers of Catan, an aerial view of the field looks like a giant Catan board. And there's going to be this combination of habitat removal and reduction, as well as seed addition. So we'll be looking at the relative relation of fragment size and active restoration methods to try and help push the field forward in restoring some of these native ecosystems. So lots of good things still to come. Bill is wondering about options for visiting Cedar Creek. At this moment, the options are sadly fairly limited because of COVID. I will drop in the chat if I can remember what the URL is. A link to our public nature trail. We do maintain a trail that passes through some of our best oak savannas on the southeast side of our property. We manage it with the city of East Bethel. It is open during COVID. You're welcome to come go for a walk. There's some informational signage, good tracking, lots of good birds. The woodpeckers will probably be back in the next month or so if you want to see red-headed woodpeckers. In the summer, we open up some additional trails in that part of the property that go down to the Bison area. And we are planning on having those trails open this summer. They were not last summer, but they will be. Other than that, we are doing online programming. We have a series kind of like this one that you attended today called Lunch with a Scientist that brings on a monthly basis staff and researchers from Cedar Creek onto, at this moment, Zoom to talk about their work. We have a monthly book club that also is meeting on Zoom that reads books related to ecology and discusses them. And then as things open up, we'll start bringing back in-person programming. So research tours, birding walks, kids programs, family programs. They'll all be on the link that I just pasted in the chat, which is our upcoming events page, as we get permission to hold them again. So I'm hopeful that by this summer, there will be some more options. But in the meantime, come take yourself for a walk on Fish Lake. Dan has a question about organizing burns on private rural acreage. That's a really good question. I would start by reaching out to looking in your county's directory, and if your county has an extension person or a restoration ecologist, someone like that, they'll be able to point you in a good direction. Often permits are given out kind of at the state DNR level, but you will have better luck getting resources and information from the DNR if you have somebody advocating for you at like your county or township level. So I would start there. It might be someone, if you have like a soil and water department at the county or an extension office, ask them and they'll be able to point you in a good direction. There are definitely grants from time to time for doing this kind of like active restoration on private land. So it's always worth looking into.
And I was going to say, if you don't want to handle all of that on your own necessarily, there are a variety of companies in the state, offhand, Prairie Restoration Incorporated, Minnesota Native Landscapes that do burns, and they contract out with the state, but they also contract with private landowners too. Obviously, there would be some additional fees with that, but that is certainly something you could look into as well.
Those are also really good sources for seed if you want to repopulate your prairies with native plants. Both of those prairie restorations and Minnesota Native Landscapes and a number of other nurseries like Prairie Moon do a phenomenal job of sourcing and producing very locally adapted species. So it's not just going to be big blue stem from who knows where. It'll be big blue stem from Minnesota or Wisconsin. And often those eco types do better than something that you would just buy from a catalog from, you know, wherever.
So I'm not seeing any other questions coming through right now. So I just want to say thank you, Caitlin or Dr. Potter, for that fabulous presentation. If people have additional questions afterwards, is there a great way for them to reach you, Caitlin?
For sure. You can always email me. I have one of the world's easiest emails to remember, so long as you spell my name correctly. I'm just caitlin@umn.edu. 2 I's, no Y's. For some reason during the pandemic, everyone has started putting a Y in my name, and that email will not go to me. So CAITLIN@umn.edu. I am juggling a lot of things at this moment, so it will probably take me a couple days to get back to you, but I will get back to you. And I am getting better at networking, so I can probably also connect you with people who can answer your questions if they're things that are outside my area of expertise. If you want to ask questions about my area of expertise, it's wildlife, and I'm always happy to talk about it.
Excellent. Well, I do just want to say thank you everyone for joining. Our Lunch with the Naturalist program will be continuing into the spring here. Our next one is April 21st. It's on native plants, specifically native plant gardening. And then May 26th, we will be talking about spring wildflowers. So if you want to sign up for those, just keep an eye out at anokacountyparks.com. That is our main website. Again, anokacountyparks.com. Otherwise, check Facebook. You may see it there as well. So yeah, that's it. If there are no other questions, I think we can wrap up. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Caitlin, for the fabulous and very interesting presentation. Be sure to get out to Cedar Creek if you can, or Wargo. Our trails are open as well. So.